The Scourge retreat came suddenly and without warning. One moment they were pressing their attack against the Coalition fleet, and the next they were withdrawing to the edge of the system in apparent disorder. Zethka watched his tactical display in amazement as thousands of biomechanical ships turned away from the battle and began accelerating toward hyperspace. Tactical analysis, he ordered his science officer, who was still trembling from the terror spore exposure, but had managed to return to his station. The enemy has lost approximately 6,000 vessels, came the shaky report. That represents 60% of their invasion force. Remaining ships are showing signs of severe damage and reduced combat effectiveness. Zethka studied the numbers, trying to make sense of what had happened. The Coalition fleet had been outnumbered 30-1 at the start of the battle. By all military logic, they should have been completely destroyed within the first hour. Instead, they had somehow inflicted such devastating losses on the Scourge that the enemy was retreating. "What are our casualties?" he asked. "Coalition losses are significant," his tactical officer replied. "We have lost 112 vessels total. The Altarian fleet has been reduced by 40%, and Centauri defense platforms are down to half strength. And the humans? The human contribution was 12 ships. All 12 vessels have been destroyed or rendered non-operational. Human casualties are listed as 847 personnel. Zethka felt his mandibles click involuntarily. Every single human ship had been lost, along with most of their crews. Yet somehow these 12 primitive vessels and their crews of less than 1,000 beings had played a crucial role in defeating an enemy that had consumed 17 star systems. As the last Scourge ships disappeared into hyperspace, the surviving Coalition vessels began damage assessment and rescue operations. Zethka ordered his ship to assist in recovering human survivors, though he suspected there would be few to find. The humans had fought with such reckless abandon that survival seemed unlikely. To his surprise, several human life pods were located, drifting in the debris field. Captain Morrison was among the survivors, along with about 200 other human personnel. They were brought aboard various Coalition ships for medical treatment and debriefing. Morrison arrived on Zethka's flagship 6 hours after the battle ended. The human captain was bandaged and walking with a limp, but his eyes held the same unsettling intensity they had shown throughout the conflict. He still looked afraid, Zethka realized. Even in victory, even in safety, the human captain carried himself like someone who expected danger at any moment. "Captain Morrison," Zethka said as they met in the medical bay, "I am pleased to see you survived." "Thank you, Commander. Though I have to admit, survival wasn't really part of our tactical planning." They walked together toward the briefing room where Morrison would give his after-action report to the Coalition commanders. As they moved through the corridors of the Valerian flagship, Zethka noticed how other crew members reacted to the humans' presence. Valerian soldiers and officers who had shown tremendous courage during the battle now seemed nervous around Morrison, giving him a wide berth as he passed. "Captain, I must ask you something that has been troubling me," Zethka said as they reached the briefing room. "Your species was affected by the terror spores just as severely as any other. I could see the fear in you and your crew throughout the battle. Yet you continued to fight with even greater intensity. How is this possible?" Morrison paused at the entrance to the briefing room, his hand resting on the door control. "You want to understand human psychology? I believe it may be crucial for future Coalition operations." Morrison nodded slowly. "The thing about fear, Commander, is that most species treat it like an enemy. They try to overcome it, ignore it, or run from it. But humans learned something different a long time ago, which is, fear is information. It tells you when something is dangerous, when the stakes are high, when everything you care about might be lost. The terror spores didn't tell us anything we didn't already know. We were already afraid." Zethka felt his skin prickle. "You were afraid before the spores were deployed?" "Commander, humans are always afraid. We're afraid of dying alone, of failing, the people who depend on us, of not being good enough when it matters most. We're afraid of losing our families, our friends, our entire species to creatures like the Scourge." Morrison's voice was steady, but his hands were still shaking slightly. The spores just made us more aware of fears we carry with us every day. They entered the briefing room where other coalition officers were waiting. As Morrison took his seat, Zethka noticed that even the battle-hardened Altarian commanders seemed uncomfortable in the humans' presence. There was something about the way Morrison moved, the way he spoke, that suggested barely controlled violence. "Captain Morrison," the Altarian fleet commander began, "your tactical methods were highly unorthodox. Could you explain your strategy?" Morrison leaned back in his chair, and for a moment his facade of control slipped. Zethka could see exhaustion, grief, and lingering terror in the human's eyes. But underneath all of that was something else, something that made Zethka's blood run cold. "Our strategy was simple," Morrison said. "We accepted that we were going to die." The room fell silent. Coalition officers exchanged glances, clearly disturbed by this casual statement. "Once you accept that death is inevitable, everything becomes much clearer," Morrison continued. "The only question left is how many enemies you can take with you, and how much time you can buy for the evacuation fleets. Every ship becomes a weapon, every crew member becomes ammunition. Fear stops being about self-preservation and starts being about legacy." "But that's suicide," the Centauri representative protested. "No, it's mathematics. The Scourge had overwhelming numerical superiority and technological advantages. Traditional tactics would have resulted in our complete defeat within hours. Our only chance was to make the cost of victory so high that they would choose to retreat, rather than continue the assault." Morrison stood and walked to the tactical display, calling up recordings from the battle. "Look at our attack patterns. Every maneuver was designed to maximize damage to the enemy, while ensuring our own destruction. We turned our ships into guided missiles, our crews into saboteurs, our fear into fury." Zethka watched the recordings with new understanding. Human tactics hadn't been reckless or chaotic. They had been precisely calculated acts of sacrifice, each one designed to inflict maximum damage on the Scourge fleet while accepting inevitable losses. "The terror spores actually helped us," Morrison continued. "They reminded us what we were fighting for. Every wave of fear told us that our families were in danger, that our entire species might be wiped out if we failed. That kind of motivation is worth more than any weapon system." "So you used fear as a tactical advantage?" Zethka asked. "We used everything as a tactical advantage. Fear, desperation, love, hate, the certain knowledge that we were going to die. Humans don't compartmentalize emotions the way other species do. We let them fuel us, drive us, push us beyond what should be possible." Morrison sat back down, his expression becoming distant. "The thing you have to understand about humans is that we've been prey animals for most of our evolutionary history. We know what it feels like to be hunted by things bigger and stronger than us. We know what it means to fight when there's no hope of survival." "And this makes you effective warriors?" the Altarian commander asked. "It makes us desperate. And desperate creatures are the most dangerous things in the universe." The briefing continued for another hour, with Morrison explaining human tactical, philosophy, and combat psychology. But Zethka found himself focusing on the way other coalition officers reacted to the human captain. They asked their questions and took their notes, but they all seemed eager for the meeting to end. They wanted Morrison gone. After the briefing, Zethka walked Morrison back to the hangar where a transport would take him to rejoin the surviving human forces. As they walked, the Valerian commander found himself struggling with questions that had been building throughout the day. "Captain, I have been thinking about what you said regarding human psychology. If your species lives in constant fear, if you have weaponized your own terror, then what does that make you in times of peace?" Morrison stopped walking and turned to face him. For a moment, his careful control slipped completely, and Zethka saw something in the human's eyes that made him want to run. It was the look of a predator that had learned to hunt while being hunted, a creature that had turned its deepest vulnerabilities into its greatest strengths. "That's the question, isn't it, Commander?" Morrison said quietly. "What do you do with a species that has learned to function while drowning in terror? What do you do with creatures who see fear not as an enemy to be defeated but as fuel to be consumed?" Morrison resumed walking toward the hangar, leaving Zethka to follow. The Scourge learned something important today. They learned that there are things in this galaxy more frightening than they are. They learned that prey animals can become hunters when the stakes are high enough. As Morrison boarded his transport, he turned back one final time. The thing about fear, Commander, is that it's contagious. The turning point came when the Scourge deployed their most feared weapon. Zethka was coordinating the defense of the system's inner planets when his science officer suddenly stiffened at his station, all four eyes widening in terror. Commander, we're detecting massive biochemical emissions from the Scourge fleet. They're releasing terror spores. Zethka felt his blood freeze. Terror spores were the reason the Scourge had conquered so many systems with minimal losses. The biological weapon didn't kill directly, but it induced such overwhelming fear in most sentient species that they became completely unable to function. Entire fleets had been found drifting in space. Their crews curled up in paralyzed terror while Scourge boarding parties harvested them at leisure. All ships, Emergency Protocol 7, Zethka broadcast. Seal atmospheric systems and activate biofilters. Prepare for chemical warfare conditions. Around him, his bridge crew was already showing signs of exposure despite their ship's protective systems. The Valerian tactical officer was trembling uncontrollably, his mandibles clicking rapidly in distress. The communications specialist had curled into a defensive position, all four arms wrapped around his torso. Even Zethka could feel the effects, beginning, a cold dread spreading through his nervous system like ice water. The terror spores didn't just cause fear. They amplified whatever natural fear responses a species possessed and magnified them beyond all reason. For Valerians, it meant visions of ancient predators from their homeworld. For Altarians, it triggered their species' instinctive terror of deep space. Every race in the Coalition had some primal fear that the spores could exploit and turn against them. Through his tactical display, Zethka watched as ship after ship in the Allied fleet began to drift off course. The Altarian cruisers were the first to succumb, their crews overcome by claustrophobic panic. Several Valerian destroyers followed, their commanders paralyzed by hallucinations of their worst nightmares. Even the mighty Centauri defense platforms went silent as their operators cowered in terror. Within minutes, the Coalition fleet was effectively neutralized. Hundreds of advanced warships floated helpless while the Scourge fleet advanced unopposed toward the inner system, where billions of civilians waited for evacuation, but the human ships kept fighting. Zethka forced himself to focus on his tactical display despite the waves of terror washing over him. The human vessels were still maintaining their attack patterns, still engaging Scourge ships with the same reckless aggression they had shown throughout the battle. If anything, they seemed to be fighting harder than before. "How is this possible?" he whispered through chattering mandibles. His communications officer managed to establish a link with Morrison's flagship, despite his obvious distress. The human captain appeared on screen, and Zethka immediately noticed something that made his skin crawl. Morrison was sweating heavily, his hands were shaking slightly, and his eyes had the wide, staring look of someone in the grip of absolute terror. But he was still giving orders to his crew, still coordinating the battle. "Morrison here," the captain said, his voice steady despite the obvious signs of fear. "We're reading massive biochemical emissions from the enemy fleet. Some kind of psychological warfare agent. Terror spores," Zethka managed to say. "They induce paralyzing fear in most species. How are your people still fighting?" Morrison's expression was grim. "Oh, we're scared, Commander. More scared than we've ever been in our lives. But that's nothing new for us." The transmission showed Morrison's bridge crew, and Zethka could see they were all affected by the spores. The human soldiers were sweating, trembling, and showing clear signs of extreme stress. But they were still at their posts, still carrying out their duties with mechanical precision. "I don't understand," Zethka said. "The terror spores should have incapacitated your entire species." "The thing about fear, Commander, is that it's just information. It tells you when something's dangerous, when the stakes are high, when you might lose everything you care about. Most species run from that feeling." Morrison paused to wipe sweat from his forehead. "We learned to run toward it." A Scourge bio-cruiser fired on Morrison's ship, sending massive energy blasts that lit up the human vessel's primitive shields. Warning lights flashed throughout the bridge, and crew members rushed to repair systems that were failing under the assault. But through it all, Morrison remained focused on the tactical situation. You see, Commander, humans have been dealing with fear for our entire evolutionary history. We evolved on a world full of predators that were bigger, stronger, and faster than us. We survived by learning to think clearly while absolutely terrified. Fear isn't our weakness, it's our oldest teacher. Zethka watched in amazement as human ships continued their assault on the Scourge fleet. Commander Pete Johnson's heavy cruiser was surrounded by enemy vessels, taking fire from all directions. Through the communication link, Zethka could see Johnson's crew working frantically at their stations while terror spores flooded their ship's atmosphere. Johnson himself was visibly struggling with the effects. His face was pale, his hands shook as he gripped his command chair and sweat dripped steadily onto his uniform. But his voice was calm and controlled as he issued orders. Engineering. I need everything you can give me on the main guns. Tactical. Target their command nodes. Helm, take us into that gap between the big ones. Sir, that's suicide. His tactical officer replied, her voice tight with fear. Probably, Johnson agreed. But we'll take a dozen of them with us. Johnson's ship dove into the center of the Scourge formation, firing everything it had while enemy weapons tore its hull apart. The human crew worked with desperate efficiency, loading weapons, rerouting power, and maintaining systems while their ship disintegrated around them. They were all clearly terrified, but their fear seemed to make them more focused rather than less. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Hayes was leading the remnants of her squadron in a flanking attack against a Scourge biocarrier. Her ship had lost most of its armor and was running on emergency power, but she pressed the attack anyway. Through her bridge communications, Zethka could hear her giving orders while fighting back what sounded like panic attacks. I can't do this, one of her officers said, his voice breaking. I can't think straight. The fear is too much. I know, Martinez, Hayes replied, her own voice shaking. I'm scared too. We're all scared. But we're going to do our jobs anyway, because that's what humans do. We're going to be brave while terrified. Her words seemed to steady her crew. They returned to their posts and continued the attack, their movements mechanical and precise despite their obvious terror. They were using their training and discipline to function while their minds screamed at them to run. This is impossible, Zethka said to himself. No species can function under this level of psychological stress. But the humans were proving him wrong. Ship after ship, crew after crew, they continued to fight while experiencing levels of fear that should have left them catatonic. They weren't immune to the terror spores, they were just refusing to let the fear stop them from doing their jobs. Carl Davis's voice came over the communications from inside another Scourge hive ship. His boarding party had somehow managed to penetrate the enemy vessel despite being affected by the terror weapon. Through the audio link, Zethka could hear Davis breathing heavily, his voice tight with strain. Fear is honest, Davis said to his team as they fought through the organic corridors. It tells you when something matters, when the stakes are real. Right now it's telling us that if we fail here, everyone we care about is going to die. So we don't fail. The human soldiers were fighting their way through a nightmare landscape while their nervous system screamed at them to flee. But they kept moving forward, kept completing their mission, kept thinking tactically despite the overwhelming psychological assault. Morrison's voice cut through Zethka's amazement. Commander, we need your fleet back in the fight. Can your people overcome the spore effects? Zethka looked around his bridge at his crew, most of whom were still cowering in terror. I don't know if we can function at this level of fear. Then don't try to overcome it, Morrison said. Use it. Fear means the mission matters. It means what we're fighting for is worth dying for. Let it remind you why you're here. Somehow, Morrison's words cut through the psychological fog. Zethka forced himself to stand straighter, to focus on the tactical display despite the waves of terror washing over him. The fear was still there, stronger than ever, but he began to see it differently. It wasn't trying to destroy him, it was trying to tell him something important. All ships, he broadcast to the coalition fleet, his voice stronger than it had been in hours. The enemy is using our fear against us, but fear is just information. It's telling us that this battle matters, that the lives depending on us are worth protecting. We will not let terror stop us from doing our duty. Slowly, other ships began to respond. Captains who had been paralyzed by fear forced themselves back to their command stations. Crews who had been hiding began returning to their posts. The coalition fleet began to reform its battle lines, while still gripped by terror, following the human example of functioning despite overwhelming fear. But as Zeth-Ka coordinated the renewed assault, the battle had been raging for 4 hours when Zeth-Ka witnessed something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. Sergeant Major Carl Davis had successfully led his boarding party inside the Scourge hive ship, but their mission had gone terribly wrong. The biomechanical vessel had sealed itself around the human soldiers, trapping them inside its living corridors, while hostile organisms swarmed toward their position. Through his ship's advanced sensors, Zeth-Ka could track the human life signs as they moved through the alien vessel's interior. The readings showed their heart rate spiking to dangerous levels, their biosignatures indicating extreme stress and fear. Any rational species would have retreated or surrendered at this point. The humans kept fighting. "Commander, we're receiving audio transmissions from inside the hive ship," his communications officer reported. "Put it through." The sounds that filled the bridge were unlike anything Zeth-Ka had ever heard. Human voices shouting orders and warnings mixed with the wet, organic noises of the Scourge interior. Weapons fire echoed through twisted passages that pulsed like the inside of some massive creature. And underneath it all was something that made Zeth-Ka's mandibles click with nervous energy. Human laughter. "Davis here," came a voice through the static. "We've reached what looks like a control center, setting charges now." "Sir, we've got movement behind us," another voice reported. "Big movement." Through the sensor readings, Zeth-Ka could see that Davis's team had been separated. 3 soldiers were with him at the control center while 2 others were cut off, in a corridor 50 meters away. Between them was something that registered on the sensors as a mass of living tissue, 12 meters long and 3 meters wide. "That's a Scourge warrior form," Zeth-Ka's science officer said quietly. "Our intelligence reports indicate they're nearly impossible to kill with conventional weapons." The warrior form was one of the most feared Scourge organisms. It had blade arms that could slice through combat armor like paper, acidic blood that could melt through metal, and reflexes faster than most species could even perceive. A single warrior form could kill dozens of soldiers before being brought down. Davis was facing it alone. "Johnson, Mitchell, get those charges set." Davis's voice came through the comm. "I'll handle our friend here." Zeth-Ka watched the sensor readings in disbelief as Davis moved toward the warrior form instead of away from it. The human's heart rate was through the ceiling. His stress indicators showed he was in a state of absolute terror, but he was advancing toward the most dangerous close combat organism in the known galaxy. The warrior form struck with blinding speed, its blade arms slashing through the space where Davis had been standing. But the human had already moved, rolling under the creature's reach and coming up with a combat knife in his hand. The blade looked pathetically small compared to the creature's natural weapons. What happened next defied everything Zeth-Ka thought he knew about combat. Davis didn't try to match the creature's reach or speed. Instead, he got closer, moving inside the warrior form's guard where its long blade arms couldn't be used effectively. The human grabbed onto the creature's torso and began stabbing repeatedly, with his knife, aiming for what appeared to be neural clusters along its spine. The warrior form tried to shake him off, slamming itself against the corridor walls, but Davis held on. His knife found critical points in the creature's biology, and within minutes the massive organism collapsed. A single human soldier had killed a Scourge warrior form in hand-to-hand combat using nothing but a metal blade and what Davis had called stubbornness. "Charges set," came Johnson's voice, moving to extraction point. But the extraction point was compromised. More Scourge organisms were flooding the corridors, and Davis's team was trapped. Their life signs were fading as the hostile environment took its toll on their equipment and their bodies. "This is Amy Rodriguez on the New York," came a new voice over the communications. "I'm reading your situation in there. Stand by." Rodriguez was the chief engineer aboard Morrison's ship. Zethka could see her vessel on his tactical display, heavily damaged from the ongoing battle but still functional. What he couldn't understand was what an engineer could do to help soldiers trapped inside an enemy hive ship. "Amy, negative," Davis responded. "There's no way to extract us from here. Complete the mission and get clear." "Not happening, Sergeant Major. We don't leave people behind." Zethka watched in amazement as Rodriguez piloted the damaged destroyer directly toward the hive ship. The Scourge vessel's defensive systems opened fire, but she kept coming. At the last moment, she fired the ship's emergency escape pods directly into the bio-ship's hull. The pods were designed to carry crew members to safety, but Rodriguez had modified them into penetrator rounds. The pods punched through the hive ship's organic armor and deployed inside the vessel. Each pod contained a small team of human soldiers who immediately began fighting their way toward Davis's position. It was a rescue mission that should have been impossible, but somehow the humans were making it work. Rodriguez's ship was dying around her as she maintained position to coordinate the rescue. Scourge weapons had torn through most of her vessel's systems and life support was failing throughout, but she stayed at her post, guiding the rescue teams through the hive ship's twisted interior. "Davis, this is Rescue Team Alpha," came a voice. "We have visual on your position. Get ready to move." The fighting inside the hive ship intensified as the rescue teams battled their way through waves of Scourge organisms. Zethka could track their progress through the sensor readings, watching as human soldiers fought room by room through an environment that was actively trying to kill them. What struck him most was their coordination under impossible conditions. These soldiers had never trained for combat inside a living alien vessel, yet they adapted their tactics in real time. They used their knowledge of Scourge biology against the creatures, targeting vital systems and exploiting weaknesses they discovered during the battle. "Rodriguez, your ship is breaking apart," Morrison's voice came through the comm. "Get to an escape pod." "Negative, Captain. I need to keep the rescue beacon active for extraction." Zethka realized what she was doing. Rodriguez was staying aboard her dying ship to maintain the communication link that would guide the rescue teams back out of the hive ship. Without that beacon, they would be lost in the organic maze of the enemy vessel. She was sacrificing herself to save soldiers she had probably never even met. "Amy, that's an order," Morrison said, his voice tight with emotion. "Sorry, Captain. Can't hear you. Must be interference from the massive explosion I'm about to cause." Rodriguez began overloading her ship's reactor while maintaining the rescue beacon. She was turning her vessel into a bomb while using her final moments to coordinate the evacuation of the boarding party. The technical skill required was staggering, but she made it look routine. "All teams, this is Rodriguez. You have 3 minutes to clear the hive ship before I light this candle. And boys, tell my daughter I'm sorry I missed her birthday party." The rescue proceeded with clockwork precision despite the chaos. Human soldiers fought their way back through corridors filled with hostile organisms while Rodriguez counted down the seconds until her ship's destruction. At the last possible moment, the final escape pod launched clear of the hive ship. Rodriguez's ship detonated 2 seconds later, taking the entire Scourge hive ship with it. The explosion was visible throughout the battle zone, a brilliant fireball that marked the sacrifice of one human engineer and the destruction of one of the enemy's most dangerous vessels. Davis and his team were recovered alive, though barely. As they were brought aboard Morrison's command ship, Zethka listened to their after-action reports. They spoke calmly about their experience inside the hive ship, discussing tactical observations and equipment performance. The only emotion they showed was when they mentioned Rodriguez. "She saved us all," Davis said simply. "That woman had more courage in her little finger than most species have in their entire military." But Zethka had been monitoring their biosignatures throughout the entire ordeal. He knew they had been terrified every second they were inside that hive ship. Their stress levels had been off the charts, their fear responses at maximum intensity. Yet they had kept fighting, kept thinking, kept coordinating their actions with deadly efficiency. The humans weren't fearless warriors. They were the most frightened soldiers Zethka had ever observed. But somehow that terror wasn't stopping them. If anything, it seemed to be driving them to greater acts of heroism and tactical brilliance. As he watched the rescue teams integrate back into the battle, Zethka felt a chill run down his spine. These creatures felt fear more intensely than his own species, yet they used that fear as fuel rather than allowing it to paralyze them. They had turned their greatest weakness into their greatest weapon. For the first time in his military career, Zethka found himself afraid of his own allies. The Scourge fleet emerged from hyperspace like a living nightmare made of metal and flesh. Zethka watched from his command chair as thousands of biomechanical vessels materialized at the edge of the system. Each ship pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to shift and writhe across their organic hulls. The largest vessels were the size of cities, their surfaces covered with what looked like breathing tissue and clusters of weapon ports that resembled eyes. "All ships, this is Commander Zethka," he broadcast on the Coalition frequency. "Enemy fleet has arrived. Begin attack pattern Delta 7. The Valerian ships moved into formation with practiced precision. Their sleek hulls gleamed as energy, shields activated, creating protective barriers of crackling light around each vessel. The Altarian cruisers took their positions on the flanks while the Centauri defense platforms powered up their massive weapons arrays. Everything proceeded exactly as planned, except for the humans. "What are they doing?" Zethka's tactical officer asked, pointing at the display. The 12 human ships had broken away from the formation and were scattering in different directions. Each vessel was taking a separate course toward the enemy fleet, moving at speeds that seemed reckless even by human standards. There was no coordination, no apparent strategy. "Open a channel to Captain Morrison," Zethka ordered. Morrison's face appeared on the communication screen. Behind him, Zethka could see human crew members moving with urgent efficiency. Warning lights flashed red throughout their bridge, and the sound of alarms was clearly audible. "Captain, you are out of formation," Zethka said. "Return to your assigned position immediately." "Negative, Commander. We're implementing our own tactical approach." "Your own tactical approach? This violates all established combat protocols." Morrison's image shook as his ship took a hit from long-range Scourge weapons. Sparks flew from a control panel near him, but he didn't even flinch. "Protocols are great when they work, Commander, but sometimes you need to improvise." The transmission cut off as Morrison's ship accelerated directly toward a cluster of enemy vessels. Zethka watched in horror as the human destroyer charged straight into the center of the Scourge formation. Energy beams lanced out from dozens of bioships, hitting the human vessel repeatedly. Armor plating vaporized under the assault, and atmosphere vented from multiple hull breaches. "They're going to be destroyed," the tactical officer said. But Morrison's ship didn't explode. Instead, it returned fire with its primitive kinetic weapons, sending streams of metal projectiles into the nearest Scourge vessel. The bullets seemed pathetically inadequate against the massive bioship, but something strange happened. The Scourge vessel's organic hull began to convulse and spasm where the projectiles hit. Within seconds, the entire ship was writhing like a wounded animal. "What kind of ammunition are they using?" Zethka demanded. His science officer ran quick scans of the human weapons fire. The projectiles appear to be coated with some form of biological agent. It's causing severe toxicity reactions in the Scourge organisms. Before Zethka could process this information fully, another human ship drew his attention. "Lieutenant Commander," Hayes was piloting her destroyer in a pattern that defied all logic. She was flying directly at a Scourge command vessel, taking heavy fire from multiple directions. Her ship was already heavily damaged, with entire sections blown away and systems failing throughout. "She's lost main propulsion," the tactical officer reported. "Her ship is dead in space," but Hayes wasn't finished. Zethka watched in amazement as she vented atmosphere from her cargo bays, using the escaping gas to push her crippled vessel toward the enemy command ship. The maneuver was crude and desperate, but it worked. Her destroyer slammed into the Scourge vessel with tremendous force, both ships exploding in a brilliant fireball that lit up the entire battle zone. The explosion took out 3 more Scourge, ships that had been clustered around the command vessel. In a single desperate act, Hayes had eliminated 4 enemy ships with her one dying destroyer. "Impossible," Zethka whispered. The battle was spreading across the entire system now. Valerian and Altarian ships engaged the Scourge fleet in carefully coordinated attacks, their energy weapons carving through biomechanical hulls with precise efficiency. But it was the human ships that drew Zethka's attention again and again. Carl Davis was leading a group of 3 human vessels against a Scourge hive ship. The enemy vessel was massive, easily 10 times larger than any of the human ships, and its hull bristled with organic weapons. Davis's approach was suicidal by any measure of tactical thinking. He took his ship directly underneath the hive ship, into the blind spot beneath its primary weapon clusters. "What is he doing?" Zethka asked aloud. The answer came when Davis's ship latched onto the Scourge vessel's hull using magnetic grappling systems. Then human soldiers in armored suits began cutting through the bioship's hull with plasma torches. They were boarding the enemy vessel. "They're going inside," the tactical officer said in disbelief. "They're actually going inside a Scourge hive ship." Zethka had read the reports from previous Scourge attacks. No one boarded their ships. The interior of a hive ship was filled with hostile organisms, toxic atmosphere, and organic weapon systems that could reshape themselves at will. It was considered absolute suicide to attempt boarding operations, but the humans were doing it anyway. Through his ship's sensors, Zethka could track the human boarding party as they fought their way through the hive ship's interior. The bioship began showing signs of internal damage as explosions erupted throughout its structure. Whatever the humans were doing inside, it was working. The massive vessel started to list and drift as its organic control systems failed. Meanwhile, other human ships were employing tactics that made no sense by conventional standards. One destroyer had positioned itself directly in the path of a Scourge tractor beam, allowing itself to be pulled toward the enemy vessel. Just before impact, the human ship detonated its entire ammunition supply, creating an explosion that gutted the Scourge ship from the inside. Another human captain had shut down his ship's engines and life support, making it appear dead in space. When a Scourge bioship moved in to investigate, the human vessel suddenly came alive and unloaded everything it had at point-blank range. The surprise attack destroyed the enemy ship before it could react. "They're using their own ships as weapons," Zethka realized. Every human vessel seemed to be fighting with the assumption that it would be destroyed. They weren't trying to survive the battle. They were trying to take as many enemies with them as possible when they died. It was a mentality that Zethka had never encountered in all his years of military service. The most disturbing example came from Captain Pete Johnson's heavy cruiser. His ship had taken severe damage from multiple Scourge vessels and was barely functional. Any rational commander would have withdrawn to a safe distance for repairs. Instead, Johnson flew his crippled ship directly into the center of the enemy formation. "All human vessels, this is Johnson," came the transmission. "I'm going to try something stupid. You might want to clear the area." Johnson's ship began overloading its reactor core while still firing all weapons. The human captain was turning his vessel into a massive bomb while continuing to fight. The Scourge ships around him seemed to realize what was happening and tried to destroy his ship before it could explode, but it was too late. The resulting detonation created a blast wave that destroyed everything within a 50-kilometer radius. 12 Scourge ships disappeared in the fireball, including a massive biocarrier that had been deploying fighter organisms. "Tactical report," Zethka ordered, his voice barely steady. "The human fleet has lost 7 ships," his officer reported. "Enemy losses are estimated at over 200 vessels." Zethka stared at the numbers, trying to make sense of them. 12 human ships had engaged 10,000 Scourge vessels and had somehow managed to destroy 200 of them. The loss ratio was impossible by every military doctrine he had ever studied. But the most disturbing part wasn't the numbers. It was the way the remaining human crews were reacting to their losses. Instead of mourning their fallen comrades or showing signs of shock, they seemed to be getting more aggressive. Their attack patterns were becoming more daring, their tactics more creative and desperate. It was as if watching their friends die had made them angrier rather than more cautious. As the battle continued, Zethka found himself focusing more on the human ships than on his own fleet's operations. There was something about the way they fought that made his skin crawl. They showed no regard for their own safety, no hesitation about sacrificing themselves for tactical advantage. They fought, like cornered animals, but with the intelligence and creativity of an advanced species. The combination was terrifying. Commander Zethka stood on the bridge of the Valerian flagship watching the human vessel approach through the viewport. The ship looked rough and crude compared to the sleek lines of his own vessel, where Valerian ships had smooth energy shields that made them glow like jewels in space. The human ship was all hard angles and visible weapon ports. It reminded him of the ancient warships his people used before they learned to bend energy to their will. The communications officer turned toward him with 4 eyes blinking in sequence. "Commander, the human captain requests permission to come aboard for the tactical briefing." Zethka flexed his mandibles in what other species might mistake for a smile. The High Council had assigned him to work with these humans as part of the coalition against the Scourge invasion. It was meant to be an easy assignment. Everyone knew humans were primitive. They had only been in space for a few hundred cycles while the Valerian Confederation had been exploring the galaxy for thousands. The humans had no energy weapons, no shields, no psionic abilities. They still used projectile weapons that fired metal slugs with chemical explosions. The Council thought it would be good experience for a young commander like himself. "Grant permission," Zethka said. "Have them escorted to briefing room 7. The human captain arrived 30 minutes later with 2 of his officers. Zethka had studied human anatomy in preparation for this assignment. They were bipedal mammals with only 2 eyes and no natural armor. The captain was a male named Jake Morrison according to the files. He had dark hair with streaks of gray and small scars on his face. His uniform was clean but showed signs of repair. The 2 officers with him were a female named Lisa Hayes and a male named Carl Davis. What struck Zethka immediately was how relaxed they seemed. The entire outer rim was under attack by the most dangerous enemy the galaxy had ever known. The Scourge had already consumed 17 star systems, turning entire worlds into biomass to feed their growing fleet. Yet these humans walked into the briefing room like they were attending a routine meeting. "Captain Morrison," Zethka said in carefully practiced human speech, "welcome aboard the Sovereign of Stars. I trust your journey was pleasant." Morrison nodded and took a seat without ceremony. "Pleasant enough, Commander. Though I have to say, your ship is impressive. That gravity control system must make things easier for your crew." Zethka felt a small surge of pride. The artificial gravity systems were indeed advanced technology that few species had mastered. It is one of our more useful innovations. Now shall we discuss the tactical situation? The holographic display activated, showing the approaching Scourge fleet. The biomechanical ships appeared as red dots swarming toward their position at the edge of the Kepler 442 system. Each ship was massive, some the size of small cities. They pulsed with organic energy and moved with the fluid grace of living things because in many ways, that was exactly what they were. "Intelligence reports indicate 10,000 enemy vessels approaching," Zethka began. "Our combined fleet consists of 200 Valerian ships, 80 Altarian cruisers, and 20 Centauri defense platforms." He paused before adding, "and 12 human vessels." Morrison leaned forward to study the display. "That's quite a numbers disadvantage. Indeed. Our tactical computers estimate a survival probability of approximately 3%. Hayes spoke up for the first time. "What kind of weapons are we facing?" Zethka manipulated the display to show detailed scans of Scourge vessels, bioplasma cannons that can melt through most armor types, tractor beams that can hold ships while boarding parties attack, living hull material that can repair itself during combat, and most dangerous of all, terror spores. "Terror spores?" Davis asked. "Biological weapons that induce extreme fear in most sentient species. They cause complete paralysis in 60% of known life forms and severe combat degradation in the remainder. Only a few species have shown any resistance." Morrison studied the data for several minutes while his officers asked technical questions about enemy tactics and capabilities. Zethka answered as best he could, though much about the Scourge remained unknown. They had appeared from beyond the galactic rim less than 2 cycles ago. and had been consuming everything in their path ever since. What about our own capabilities? Morrison finally asked. What can your ships do? Zeth-Ka felt more comfortable discussing Valerian technology. Our vessels are equipped with quantum disruptor beams that can penetrate most armor. We have energy, shields that can deflect physical projectiles and absorb directed energy attacks. Our ships can coordinate through psionic links for perfect tactical synchronization. Impressive, Morrison said. And the Altarians? Similar technology with some variations. Their ships are faster but less heavily armored. The Centauri platforms are immobile but carry the heaviest weapons in the Coalition. Morrison nodded slowly. And what do you know about human capabilities? The question caught Zeth-Ka off guard. He had assumed the humans would already know their own limitations. Well, your ships appear to use conventional propulsion and kinetic weapons. No energy shields or directed energy weapons detected. Chemical explosives for close combat situations. Anything else? Zeth-Ka searched his memory for other details from the briefing files. Your crews appear to be all biological with no cybernetic enhancement. Average physical capabilities within normal parameters for your species. No psionic abilities detected. Morrison exchanged glances with his officers. Hayes was trying not to smile while Davis examined his fingernails with apparent fascination. Is something amusing? Zeth-Ka asked. Not at all, Commander. Just making sure we understand the situation correctly. Morrison stood and walked to the display. So we have 10,000 enemy ships coming at us, and they have weapons that can melt through armor and spores that paralyze most species with fear. That is correct. And our job is to stop them from reaching the inner systems where billions of civilians are waiting to be evacuated. Also correct. Morrison turned back to face him. Well, that's not the worst odds we've faced. Zeth-Ka stared at the human captain, wondering if the translation software was malfunctioning. Captain, perhaps you do not fully understand the situation. The mathematical probability of success is virtually zero. We are facing an enemy that has never been defeated. They have consumed entire civilizations. I understand perfectly, Commander. Morrison's voice was calm and steady. The question is, are we going to sit here calculating odds, or are we going to figure out how to win? Hayes leaned back in her chair. Jake's right. Numbers don't tell the whole story. We've beaten worse odds before. When? Zeth-Ka demanded, his mandibles clicking in agitation. Davis looked up from his fingernails. Last Tuesday. The casual way. He said it made Zeth-Ka's skin crawl. These humans were either completely insane or they knew something he didn't. Looking at their relaxed postures and confident expressions, he was starting to suspect it might be both. Perhaps we should begin detailed tactical planning, Morrison suggested. The Scourge will be here in 18 hours. That gives us time to get creative. As the briefing continued, Zeth-Ka found himself watching the humans more carefully. They asked good questions and offered useful suggestions, but there was something else. Something in their eyes that made him uncomfortable. They looked at the approaching enemy fleet not with the resignation he expected, but with something that might have been anticipation. For the first time since receiving this assignment, Zeth-Ka began to wonder if the High Council had been wrong about humans being primitive. Perhaps there were different kinds of advancement, and maybe the humans had found one that didn't show up on their sensors.